following U.S. President Donald Trump's assertion that moving forward, his administration will be America first, many people across Africa are closely watching and listening to find out what the president has in store for the continent. For some insight on the areas where the U.S. engages with Africa, I spoke with J. Peter Pham, Vice President and Director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. In part one of our conversation, he talks about major development challenges facing Africa.
I think the biggest challenge Africa faces in development is getting the infrastructure. And by this, I mean not just physical infrastructure, there's a great need of that, certainly, but also the legal, social, and political infrastructure necessary for development to take off. There's a huge gap between what Africa needs and which African leaders have recognized in their vision for 2063 and other development documents, and what is currently available. So there's that gap. Call it a funding gap, if you will, but it's not just about money. It's about social, legal, and political architecture.
Now, if we may just zero in a bit on the legal infrastructure, is this more about making sure that the resources of the continent are protected in such a way that foreign investment, for example, is not just exploiting the continent, or is it also just to kind of a way to facilitate this foreign investment so in a way that will benefit both the investor and the continent?
I think you need a legal infrastructure that protects investors. Otherwise, you're not going to get foreign direct investment of the level needed to build out Africa's physical infrastructure and to develop its resources in a way that benefits the entire world, but especially Africa's people. So a legal infrastructure that gives protection to investors, but also one that gives protection to citizens as well, because citizens are also involved in business, both as employees of businesses, but also as entrepreneurs. And we know the great dynamism of the African entrepreneur that is there. But it's also about rule of law, and that's a question of governance, because nothing scares away investors and business and opportunities as much as lack of governance, lack of rule of law, and nothing attracts it as much as that certainty of the rule of law, fair treatment under the law.
When I speak to African leaders and many other players, especially at the national level, each country seems to believe that they have the necessary environment for foreign direct investment. And what does it take for a country to realize that, you know, what you have is not ideal, in as much as you may get the feeling that people are still coming in, people are investing?
People are interested, they're looking, but very quickly, those who are looking look at the details. And very often, there's lack. Sometimes it's due to simply lack of capacity. Sometimes it's perhaps more malevolent than that. But there are obstacles still. Part of it is the rule of law. Part of it is legal certainty. Part of it is market size. Quite simply, the colonial borders are drawn in such a way that single African countries are often not sufficient in scale, but Africans can overcome this. We see this in East Africa, with the East Africa community forming a large market block that makes sense for business to invest in. So I think there are African leaders with vision and African countries that are already pioneering some solutions. So we should look for these best practices.
Now, looking at things from the U.S. perspective, the U.S. Agency for International Development has been involved in Africa for quite a while. Right now, what would be your assessment of how well it has done and what could be done to help the continent benefit from that program?
Well, one thing about the American people, and this has been true through time, is the incredible generosity of the American people, especially when they see real need. And this has largely been something, and this is important to emphasize at a moment of political transition in the United States. The support for Africa, for Africa's development, for the challenges Africa faces, has largely been bipartisan. There's been great continuity in policy from the Clinton administration to the George W. Bush administration to the Obama administration, and one I think is guardedly optimistic to the Trump administration. There's been broad support. President George W. Bush, a Republican, quadrupled the level of foreign direct assistance to Africa during his years in office from the levels he inherited from President Clinton. And President Obama, to his credit, despite the fact that U.S. aid and other budgets were cut by roughly 20-25% in other areas of the world, more or less kept the Bush levels of funding for Africa. So there's broad continuity. Hopefully that continues in the new administration. So that bipartisan comedy is something we hope to continue. Now, that doesn't mean that all that money was well spent. And I think the new administration should look at what works and what doesn't, what is sustainable, what isn't, and try to get the most value not only for the American taxpayer who's footing the bill, but also for the Africans who this is supposed to help.
Well, tomorrow on Africa 54, we'll bring you part 2 of my conversation with J. Peter Pham, focusing on the quantity, quality, and value of U.S.-Africa trade.